In this video, we'll be talking about Fujifilm's XC 35mm f2 prime lens. Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. In this Gear Shorts video, I wanted to share my thoughts on Fujifilm's cheapest prime lens, the XC 35mm f2. Now, this isn't a lens that I would typically buy for myself or add to my kit because of its plastic construction, but since I have one on hand, I thought it would be a good chance to, discuss my thoughts on it and who I think it's for. So in the end, it's a great little lens if you can get past a few shortcomings. Image quality with this lens really doesn't bear talking about. If you've seen the multitude of videos out there about the XF 35mm f2, you've seen this lens. Image quality is the same. The differences lie in the build and the handling, but let's take a quick overview of the image quality here before we get into the lens itself. Now, this is a contrasty lens with good sharpness. Now, the center is decent when used wide open, and it reaches its best by around f4 or f5.6. Now, the extreme corners are maybe not the sharpest that you'll see, and they really only get good by about f8. But at this price, is absolutely a good performer. Now, if you're after corner-to-corner sharpness, the new XF 33mm f1.4 is definitely the lens to go with. Now, chromatic aberration is also well handled, and I really didn't see any fringing in my day-to-day use of this lens, so nothing to worry about there. The vignette is quite pronounced at f2 and f2.8, but Fujifilm has an inbuilt profile that takes care of that if you want to remove it automatically. Now, the one thing I did notice was a bit of flare when lights got close to the edge of the frame, but under normal circumstances it performed really well, and it remained contrasty even with the sun in the frame. Aside from that, there's really not much to say. This lens produces good quality, contrasty images. Holding an XF lens in one hand and an XC lens in the other, you definitely know where the money goes. Now, it's not to say that this lens feels poorly constructed, but it lacks the sort of heft and refinement of the XF lenses. Now, it also doesn't inspire confidence that it will last a long time like a metal lens does. Now, speaking of metal, the mount on this is also plastic, and that is a bit of a worry for me. You also won't find any weather seals at all on this lens, so there's a good chance that over time water or dust will find its way into the lens. And while I don't really place my full trust in the weather seals that manufacturers put in their lenses, that is just one more line of defense that this lens simply doesn't have. The other thing that this lens is missing is an aperture ring. Now, this isn't an issue in and of itself, but it does mean that if you use XF lenses as well, you will need to get used to a different way of working with your aperture just for this lens. Now, it wasn't really a big deal for me, as I have the front dials on my XT cameras that I don't use anyway, and I could just set that up to change the aperture and just remember that I was using this lens each time. Now that we've got the technical stuff out of the way, let's have a chat about the lens itself. Now, it's a fun lens to use, and I actually ended up getting this copy for a Fujilove lens guide that I needed to produce, and I really needed some extensive time working with the lens in order to talk about it effectively, so I actually took it with me on a cycling trip to Vietnam. I got some great use out of it while I was there and while the weather was dry, but on the rainy days I dropped it straight into a Ziploc bag with my passport and I didn't take it out at all. Now, my main concern with this was not that maybe I would damage this really cheap lens, but since there's no gasket on the back of the lens, I was a little worried that water might get inside my X-T5 and that would be ever so slightly more disastrous than destroying or damaging a $200 lens. Other than that, though, it was a superb lens to work with. The good image quality, the fast aperture made it really useful for a lot of different situations. And, for my regular travel work, I'm usually in some really gritty places and I need the toughest gear that I can find so that I can really trust it. But for this trip, I was just cycling and then I was going down to meet my wife. So, photographing the markets in Hoi An, general travel stuff, maybe photos of my lunch, a quick visit to the Mison ruins, and this lens performed beautifully. Autofocus with this lens is fast, but not quite as fast and confident as my regular XF 33mm f1.4. Now, I noticed that the XC lens tended to struggle a little bit in lower contrast, and I also noticed quite a few out of focus images when I got home from the trip. Now, these weren't just slight misses. They were shot at f8, focused in bright, high contrast light, and it was really a shame to see this sort of performance, as it reminded me a lot of the X100 series cameras, when it will just sort of randomly miss. Overall though, I really can't fault the XC 35mm for this price. It's a great little lens, and over the course of my trip I got some photos that I was really happy with. So with this lens being so cheap and essentially the same formula as the XF 35mm f2, who would I recommend it for? Well, I would say it's great for anyone who has one of the lower end bodies that doesn't have the weather sealing, and also maybe doesn't mind the slightly cheaper feel of a plastic lens. And also, since you don't have an aperture ring, you have to be comfortable using one of the command dials to change your aperture. So if any of those boxes can't be checked for you, then maybe the XF version of this lens is, a better buy. And if you want the best of the best, of course, there's the XF 33mm f1.4, and then of course, finally, there is the XF 35mm f1.4 for a little bit of that old school Fujifilm feel, for those who want a really fast aperture and don't mind skipping weather sealing and blazing fast autofocus. So, as always, I hope you've enjoyed this quick look at the cheapest of cheap lenses, and if you have, I'd really appreciate a thumbs up below. Enjoy the slideshow following the video, and feel free to ask any questions that you might have in the comments section. See you in the next video.